about something that happened that long ago, how could we possibly know that something happened so far ago? Well, this question, did Jesus raise from the dead, is a very important question to answer. I think it's one of the most important questions that we can answer. Why is that? Well, if Jesus was raised from the dead, then Christianity is true, and Jesus is Lord. It would be the worst possible mistake to reject. If Jesus raised from the dead, Christianity is true, and Jesus is Lord. Think about that. Rejecting the Lord, the God-man who came down, died, and was raised from the dead. Rejecting him would be the worst mistake. However, if Jesus was not raised from the dead, you put up the next slide. If Jesus was not raised from the dead, then Christianity is alive. Guess we don't have to. That's okay. If he was not raised from the dead, then Christianity is alive, and we are risking our lives. So our entire basis for being here hinges on one event. As I have studied different religions in our world, I've seen that Christianity is different for a few reasons. But one of those reasons is that it has one event which it is sort of based on, and it culminates at the resurrection of Jesus. We have the Old Testament prophesying toward this event thousands of years before. For example, Isaiah 53. By his wounds we are healed. And then we see Jesus come, prepared for him by others, and he comes and he lives a life, he does ministry here on earth, and then dies. And that goes to the Bible. Our Savior is dead. But he had to die because of sin. Because God's wrath must be satisfied. Our Savior had to die on a cross. Then the resurrection comes in. Jesus rises from the dead. This solves the problem. He raises from the dead to give us life. That's what Christianity is based on. So this morning, this is very important that we know what we believe about this event. If you're here gathering with the believers and you don't know what you believe about Jesus' resurrection, I ask you please consider these truths that we speak of this morning. 1 Corinthians 15:14 reads, if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain. What I'm doing right now is in vain. Vanity, meaningless, worthless, and your faith is in vain. It's worthless, meaningless. If Jesus was not raised from the dead, there's no point to what we're doing. Now I'll skip forward. 1 Peter 3:15. This is the famous apologetic verse. This is last week you ended your apologetic series, and this is still this is an example of a specific apologetic looking at the evidence for resurrection. 1 Peter 3:15. But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make an offense for anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect. This has the Greek word apologia. What does that mean? Anyone know? Apologia. It means defense. So to make a defense for the faith that is within you. This is the famous verse. This is the one that apologists use to justify their existence as apologists. I don't mean that in a bad way. But as we read that chapter in context, we see that the point of 1 Peter 3:15 is not actually to defend your faith. The point is to do it with gentleness and respect. 1 Peter has a lot of talk about respect, respecting one another, respecting, right before this, it's wives and husbands, respect. And then he goes into whenever people are trying to harm you, defend your faith with gentleness and respect. Gentleness and respect is the focus. I urge you, please treat these topics, lead them with love. I see a lot of apologists who will read this verse and say, let's defend our faith, and then go out and attack and break down. But the point of this verse is to defend with gentleness and respect. Okay, we can talk about the resurrection now. Would you all pray with me? Father, I thank you for your grace. I thank you that you did make a way for us to be saved, that you made a way for us to know you intimately, to have a personal relationship with you. What wonderful news. It's sad that way had to include your son Jesus dying for us. What wonderful news that he was raised from the dead. I pray that as we look at the historical evidence for that resurrection, that we might be equipped for ministry and edified by these truths. We love you, Lord. In your name we pray. Amen. All right, so there was way too much evidence for the resurrection for me to fit into a sermon. So we're gonna look at one small part and one defense of it, if you will. So what we're going to be doing is looking at the historical bedrock. That's historian language for the minimal facts that virtually all scholars agree on. There's not a real scholar alive today who rejects these facts that we'll be speaking about today. There are people who you might meet at school who reject these facts, but in a scholarly field, these are not rejected. These are assumed to be true, and then we'll draw our conclusions from those points. So the first historical bedrock, the first minimal fact that virtually all scholars agree on, is that Jesus was real. Jesus died by Roman crucifixion, and Jesus was buried. Our first point for this is that there are more than 24,000 ancient manuscripts of the New Testament, Gospels, and letters which refer to these things happening. 24,000. Would you put up? Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So if we look here at this chart, we see this list of people who you might have heard about in your history classes. You'll hear about some of them in your philosophy classes. I spent a lot of years studying Aristotle, studying Plato, I think it was up there, yeah. Aristotle, how many numbers or copies of his works do we have? Looks like 20, or is that 49? 49 copies of Aristotle's works. Does anyone believe that Aristotle was not real? No. Plato, 7 copies up the top. Does anybody believe Plato was not real? No. Our whole Western way of thinking was formed by Aristotle and Plato. Yet there were that few copies compared to the 56,000 copies of the New Testament, and then 24,000 copies of those copies later on produced, and of the Old Testament, referring to those events that would come. The point here is nobody assumed those other works were not written by the people who they were supposed to be written by, or that those works did not actually speak of true events, and yet the New Testament has way more ancient manuscript support for these things actually happening. More than that, 99.5% of the words in those copies are accurate among each other. That means that 99.5%, that's the vast majority of the thousands of words in here, were the same in the old manuscripts. And those differences that there were very subtle. They weren't grand, they weren't significant. That's a big deal. Okay, what else? Josephus, he's a Jewish historian that was born just 4 years after Jesus' death. He grew up in a really unique situation. He had both Roman and Jewish influence. He was a historian who a lot of people look to see what the early Christian life and the Jewish life was like during the time of the church's spreading, the beginning of this following of Jesus Christ. So he wrote Antiquities of the Jews, 1863. At this time, there was a wise man called Jesus. This is outside of the Bible. This is not in your Bibles. At this time, there was a wise man called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. Many people among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him crucified, and to die. What else? Tacitus has been deemed the greatest Roman historian. The greatest Roman historian. That's how scholars view him. What did he write? 80 years after Jesus' death, he wrote, Nero tortured those whom the common people call Christians, a group hated for their abominable crimes. Their name comes from Christ, who, during the reign of Tiberius, had been executed by the procurator Pontius Pilate. So there are not only things in your Bible, which was not just written as a book, it was written as individual letters and stories, describing things by individual people, not written by one person, written by one God through man, but individual human beings. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John wrote these gospels, these narratives about what they saw happening with Jesus. But if that's not enough for you, we have Josephus, we have Tacitus. Now, how do we view Tacitus? What does the scholarly field view him as? This guy who's referring to Christ. Robert Vorst, he wrote, Tacitus seems to use his sources carefully, and he writes an account whose basic accuracy has never been seriously challenged. The point that I want you to understand is just that these things actually happened. Jesus was actually real, Jesus actually died, he was actually dead. That's not really up for debate. Okay, what's the second historical fact that virtually all scholars agree on? Jesus' tomb was found empty. Surprisingly enough, this is, of the four facts I'll cover, this is the one that is the most up for debate. It's strange to me. I think there's a ton of evidence for it. But it's the only one that has received a little bit of pushback in an academic field. But let's look at how the early church viewed Jesus' tomb and how the ancient Near East viewed it. So Matthew 28, would you turn there with me? Matthew 28, that's in your New Testament, the first book of it. And it's the last chapter of that book, Matthew 28. We'll be reading Matthew 28, verses 12 through 15. And when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, and that's the guards and the chief priests, when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a significant sum of money to the soldiers and said, tell people, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. So they took the money and did as they were directed. And this story has been spread among the Jews to this day. So after Jesus supposedly raised from the dead, after he died by Roman crucifixion, and then was buried, they found that his tomb was empty. Now, what was the early response to that empty tomb? Well, obviously the empty tomb shows that his body is gone, so we need to do something about that. Let's say that the disciples came in and stole the body of Jesus. So that was the early response to the empty tomb. It was to say that the disciples came and stole the body of Jesus. Why would the Jews circulate that story if the tomb was not actually empty? Justin Martyr, 100 years after Jesus' death, he wrote, so he's a historical guy, not alive today, 2,000 years ago. He wrote, his disciples stole him by night from the tomb where he was laid when unfastened from the cross, and now deceive men by asserting that he has risen from the dead and ascended to heaven. That's again the early response to these events is that the disciples came and stole the body. That means there was an empty tomb. The empty tomb is assumed. They're arguing that the body was stolen. Tertullian, 170 years after Jesus' death and resurrection, said, this is he, referring to Jesus, whom the disciples secretly stole away, that it might be said he has risen again. So again, he's saying, all these people are saying that Jesus has risen. This is what the early church is being based on. All of these awful people called Christians are going out and saying, I follow this man who is God, who raised from the dead after being killed. And my response to that is that the disciples stole the body from the tomb. He did not actually rise. But that assumes that the tomb was empty. That's what we need to take away here. How else can we assume the tomb was empty? Well, Jesus was buried in Jerusalem, a public place where anybody could have gone, not anybody, but they could have gone to the tomb that he was buried in, which was close to the place he was killed, and rolled that stone away, or just went into the tomb and looked and saw, hey, Jesus' body is there. That never happened. We have no account of that. So the tomb was empty. How else can we assume this? This is going to maybe sound shocking to some of you, not sexist. The tomb was first discovered empty by women. Now, in our modern day, that wouldn't be a big deal. Great, that's awesome. Women discovered the empty tomb. But first century Israel, the time when Jesus walked, did not view women in the same way that society views women today. First century Israel considered women morally and intellectually deficient. This is what the Jewish law says about women. This will be a shock. It says, any evidence which a woman gives is not valid. That's awful. So the Jewish law, the Jews assumed that women were not able to say these things, that their word was not valid. So why in the world would the gospel writers choose women to be the ones who went and found that the tomb was empty? That would not make anybody believe the story. Now we know today that women are not intellectually and morally deficient. We accept women's word as truthful without cause to believe that it's not. And we can see that doesn't mean that the story is untrue, but the point is the gospel writers would not have chosen women if they were lying. If they were lying about these events, they would have picked some strong man who everybody respects to have found the empty tomb. So it can be assumed with certainty that Jesus' tomb was found empty after he died. What's our third bit of historical bedrock? Well, the disciples, so let's just real quick look at what we have so far. Jesus was real, he died, he was buried. That's true. Then, shortly after that, Jesus' tomb that he was buried in was found empty. Okay, now what? Number 3, the disciples had experiences that they believed to be appearances of the risen Jesus. So those who followed Jesus, after he died and was raised, they said that he came to them and did things. This is not so true. We won't assume it's true that those things actually happened, but we all have to admit that they believed that they did. How can we know this? Well, would you turn to 1 Corinthians 15? That's after Matthew. We go Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7. This is the earliest known creed of the Christian church. A creed is an oral tradition, something which the early followers of Jesus started to say and reproduce. This is the earliest one, I believe, the earliest one that we know of. How is that so? Well, 1 Corinthians was a book that was written really early on. It was written just around 20 years after Jesus' death. That's really early in history. That's just 20 years after Jesus died, is when this letter was written by Paul. And then Paul says that these words are words that he received and is passing on to the Corinthians. So Paul was told these words by someone else. I believe that he received these words from the apostles of Jesus, the disciples who walked with him. I believe that Paul received these words from them. What are these words? What is this creed that Paul is passing on to the Corinthians? Let's read it. 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 7. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received. That's that oral tradition language. That Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures. That he was buried. That he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. That's referring to the Old Testament that wrote about these things that would happen. And that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Then he goes on and includes his own words to this oral tradition. Last of all, he appeared to me as one untimely born. For I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. He goes on. But that language was one of the first things that the early church produced publicly. This oral tradition that says what? What did they choose to pass on? It is that Jesus died, raised from the dead, and then appeared to people. He appeared to us, those who are speaking this forward. This is what early church evangelism was built on. It was, I saw Jesus rise from the dead. You should believe in him. I believe in him. So this is fantastic. Historians want to find the earliest documents that we can that point to the events and look at the accuracy of those. And this is the one. This is the earliest thing that we have that says Jesus raised from the dead. What else? So that's Paul who wrote this. This wasn't written in a book. This was written as a historical letter to a church. But what else? We have in Luke 24, verses 33 through 34. If you put them on the screen, that'd be fantastic. So this is a separate man, separate account, separate eyewitness. He said, and they rose that same hour and returned to Jerusalem. And they found the 11 first to the apostles, and those who were, remember there were no longer 12 at this point, and those who were with them gathered together, saying, the Lord has really risen. Some of your translations say, he's risen. The Lord has really risen and has appeared to Simon. That's the same as Peter. So this is a separate person, separate from Paul, who wrote that the Lord appeared to Simon. And this language in the Greek is really interesting because it's this, the Lord has really risen. It's a response to something that was talked about. So it was already, people were hearing that the Lord rose and appeared to Simon. And this is the response to that. Wow, he really actually did it. He actually rose. And so that shows again, the earliest belief was that the risen Jesus appeared to disciples. And that's what they believed. They had experiences of the risen Jesus. We'll go back to Josephus. He wrote, again, this is the guy who was born 4 years after Jesus' death. Super early on, he was there in the heart of it when Christianity was booming for the first time. He wrote, Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. That's about Jesus. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They recorded that he appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. And up until this very day, the tribe of Christians, that's cool, the tribe of Christians named after him has not died out. So again, very on, this is not church history, this is Jewish history. He was not a fan of Jesus. He had no reason. He was a Jew. His father was a powerful priest in the Jewish religion, and he had no reason to say that these things are true, yet he did, because he cared more about reporting true history than about defending his friends who probably hated Jesus because he was claiming to do something that only God can. And what did he write? He wrote that these disciples claimed that Jesus came and appeared to them after his death. If I die as a human being, I cannot come back and appear to you guys. This is significant. So why are all of these people claiming that Jesus appeared to them? Now, we'll look at a modern scholar, Howard Clark. He very respected it. He wrote, virtually all recent scholars conclude that the disciples thought they had seen the risen Jesus. Atheists will tell you this. The disciples thought that they saw the risen Jesus. It doesn't mean that they really did. That's what they believed. What else? Our last bit of historical bedrock. Those disciples' lives were dramatically changed, and many were eventually murdered for their belief in their religion. So like Tacitus, very early on in history, the greatest Roman historian, your school history teachers would call Tacitus that. What did he write? Nero tortured those whom the common people call Christians, who hated for their abominable crimes. We see there's evidence that early on in history, this is not in favor of the Christian account. Tacitus had no reason, again, to defend Christianity. What did he write? He wrote that Christians were tortured and hated. So that's what signing up for Christianity meant. If you claim to see the risen Jesus, it would mean that you would be tortured and hated. Just keep that in our minds. Now I'll walk through one example of a man. I wish I could do this with every apostle, or with every disciple of Jesus. I don't have time for that. We'd be here in 3 weeks. But the Apostle Paul, we'll walk through him. And if this is a lot of information, if any of this is of interest to you, after I printed out a couple documents and put them in that corner. I have a paper I wrote on the Apostle Paul's conversion, so everything I'm about to talk about quickly. And then also my notes for this sermon, which have all the quotes that we've been through. So you can grab one. If they're out, just come ask me. I'll get you another copy. Okay, the Apostle Paul. How was his life changed? What's the historical evidence for it? Well, before he knew Christ, Paul was a Pharisee and persecuted the church. He wrote that himself in Philippians 3, 5-6, 1 Corinthians 15, 9, Galatians 1:13. Remember, this is not one document. Paul wrote that as 3 separate letters to individual people, and they were later put into what we know as the Bible today. Paul was a Pharisee, persecuted the church. He hated Christians, hated them. How do we know he hated them? Because according to Luke, a separate eyewitness, separate from Paul, he wrote that Paul had Stephen executed, killed him. He had him killed, and ravaged the church, persecuting it greatly. So there's evidence that Paul hated Christians. Not only did he talk the talk, he walked the walk, he had them killed. Paul suddenly started to refer to himself, this is crazy, in his letters, Paul started to refer to himself as a servant and apostle of Jesus Christ. We see servant in Romans 1:1, Philippians 1:1, apostle, we see it in Romans 1:1, 2 Timothy 1:1, Ephesians 1:1, Galatians 1:1. His letters started to Christians as Paul, an apostle and servant of Jesus Christ. So this great, powerful man, trained under Gamaliel, a rich Pharisee, just all this power and wealth and great education, Pharisee, had everything. He writes about that in his own Corinthians. He had everything he could have wanted. And what did he do? Suddenly he starts to write, he's a servant of Jesus. We know what that means that you're signing up for. We know that means that you're signing up to, in the early church, to be tortured by Nero. Next, we see that from Luke and from Paul himself, they both wrote about this, that Paul claimed that the reason for Paul's radical conversion to Christianity was because of a personal experience with the risen Jesus. So, for some man to go from having all this power and hatred for a group to suddenly becoming a part of that group, something really big has to happen in their life. If I hated a group of people and I killed some of them, I would not suddenly give up all of my wealth and power and well-being to join them. That makes zero sense. Something big must happen to make me make that transformation. Paul and Luke tell us what that is. It is that they claim that Paul saw Jesus Christ after he raised from the dead. The story goes that Paul was walking on the road to Damascus, the city, and he was blinded by a light, and that he responds, Lord, and that this Jesus sends him out. He's healed by Christians, but that he's sent out to do ministry. Now that's a grand experience that would leave me shuddering, collapsing on my knees, saying, okay, I'll follow you, I'll stop killing your people. The question from Jesus was, why are you persecuting me? Why are you hurting my people? That would, I would drop. I'm sorry, I'm not doing it anymore, and I will follow you. Now, that's what Paul said happened. That's the only proper response to that sort of thing. It makes sense why Paul would give up everything he had. What's next? Well, Paul wrote to the Corinthians about being whipped, beaten, stoned by the Jews. It's not like stone, that's like rocks and mud, right? Being shipwrecked, in danger from many people, often hungry and thirsty, and cold and without shelter. So that's 2 Corinthians 11, 24 to 20. So Paul, again, gave up everything. We want to make that clear. Paul lived a fantastic life in the world's setting, in the world's eyes. He had everything he wanted and then gave it all up in order to follow Jesus. Makes no sense. We have a modern scholar today who wrote that Paul's inclusion of his sufferings would not have accomplished his desired goal with the Corinthians unless it honestly reflected his true known experiences. That basically just means that these words are true, and Paul would not have included them in his letter to the Corinthians about being whipped and beaten by the Jews. He wouldn't have included those unless they were actually true, because the Corinthians would have known that they weren't true. People knew Paul as a public figure, and they would have known that he was lying about these things. So we can trust these words. Okay, lastly, Paul was martyred for his faith in Jesus. That means killed. For his faith in Jesus. It's going to be a lot really quickly, so just hang on. First Clement in AD 95. So if Jesus died in AD 30, 33, you can do the math. This is about 60 years after that. So AD 95, First Clement wrote Paul's death. He wrote about Paul's death as a great example in the context of suffering. Those are just the evidence that Paul was actually killed for his faith, right? Ignatius in AD 107 wrote to the Ephesians that Paul was slain for God as the greatest example of imitation. Polycarp, in his letter to the Philippians, 9:1-2, right after the death of Ignatius, wrote a letter to the Philippians that included that Paul had been martyred. The Acts of Paul, shortly after that, indicate that Paul was killed by beheading. Tertullian, at the start of the 2nd century, stated that Nero had Paul beheaded in Rome. And then Eusebius confirmed this tradition in the early 4th century. It goes on and on and on. The early church belief and historical evidence is that Paul was killed for his faith. We have this for almost each of the disciples of Jesus that originally walked with him. Each of them were, almost every one of them were killed, probably given the chance to say that they were lying. But no. These early disciples of Jesus decided to continue saying it was true. They actually saw Jesus risen from the dead come to them. this is a big deal. In one of my history classes, I read a book or a letter from this gal who was an early disciple of Jesus, maybe 100 years after this, and she wrote in her diary her experiences in prison, being locked up for her faith in Jesus, and what they kept telling her was to say that she was lying. So whenever they would do this, they would often give you the chance to say that you don't actually believe in God, or that what you've seen didn't actually happen, the miracles you've experienced didn't actually happen. Yeah, your leg was there supposedly, and then the next minute it wasn't there, and the next minute it's there. This miracle happens, sure, you're lying about that. Tell me that you're lying and we won't kill you. And they would say, no, I believe in Jesus. That's what the disciples did. When given the opportunity, probably, to say that Jesus was not their Savior, to say that they did not see him rise from the dead, they stuck to what they knew as true. And they were willing to die because they truly believed that they had an experience with words and deeds. So, what historical facts do we have? We have that Jesus was real. He died. He was killed, crucified. And then that he was buried. Then we have, shortly after that, they find his tomb is empty. That's weird, that his tomb is empty. Tombs don't naturally go empty. If you bury someone, a few days later, they'll still be there. I'd be creeped out too, yeah. Then after that, we have the disciples who kept on being Christians and claiming that they saw Jesus rise from the dead. 500 at one point. Then we have those people being tortured, having their lives dramatically transformed, and then being killed. And everything that I just said is considered historical fact. None of that is church speculation. An atheist will tell you everything that I just told you. Now, the most obvious, we're wrapping up, don't worry. The most obvious conclusion of those historical facts is that Jesus actually rose from the dead. However, that would mean that a miracle occurred. And today we have a problem with miracles. We live in a world that prioritizes naturalism, a science that says that everything is physical and nothing is spiritual, and that miracles can't happen. And that's a relatively new idea in the last few hundred years. But yeah, now people doubt that the resurrection happened. If you doubt that the resurrection happened, it's probably because you doubt that a miracle can occur. Because the evidence that we just walked through is dramatic, is grand. There's more evidence that Jesus rose from the dead than any other event in all of history. No event has this much historical documentation. I've looked. People did not write about Aristotle the same way that they wrote about Jesus. And Aristotle started our Western civilization. So why is there so much evidence for this? Why do we doubt it? We have a problem with miracles. Hopefully this can help you out a little bit. If God exists, you can write this down. If God exists, then miracles are possible. There no longer is a problem with miracles if God exists. That solves the problem, because a supernatural being who created the world could certainly choose to supernaturally act in that world as he chooses. Now this is wild. If God even possibly exists, if you think there's a chance that he exists, then miracles are also possible. How's that so? Well, if God does exist, miracles are possible. If he might exist, then there's a chance that he exists, and if he does, then miracles are possible. So, if you think that he does exist, then you should believe in the resurrection of Jesus. If you think that he might exist, then you can recognize the truth that miracles are possible. There's a possibility that they are true, and all of the historical evidence is in favor of a real resurrection. Now, people, again, have a problem with this. So there have been a lot of alternative hypotheses, a lot of other answers to these historical facts that we talk about. I'm just going to cover very quickly 3 of them. So one is the mass hallucination theory. They say that hallucinations took place in each of the disciples that were caused by extreme stress. There's a guy, his first name is Stephen, I don't remember his last name, but he does a really good job of explaining why each of the disciples who claimed to have a hallucination of the 12 would have experienced a hallucination in that moment. Now, the problem with this is it's pure speculation, significantly lacking in evidence. There's no reason to believe that these guys actually have hallucinations. It's impossible to psychoanalyze somebody from 2,000 years ago. If I'm sitting across the room from you, it's really hard for me to determine what's going on with you. It's really hard. Like, these professionals will tell you it's extremely difficult to do that with someone that you're seeing, to say you saw a hallucination. That's really hard. It's impossible to do that with someone who lives 2,000 years ago that we've never met, especially with the information presented in the Gospels. There's nothing that shows these guys as crazy or whatever would have led to believe they hallucinated. Okay, in the rare documented cases of group hallucinations, every person sees something different. So group hallucinations have happened a couple times, but in every one of those cases, every person sees something different. So there might be one dude over here tripping out saying, the cupboards are moving, but someone over here is just like, hey, grandma. You know, they're never the same thing. They're not the same. So that kind of debunks the theory that 500 people at once saw the same man come and say the same things. No, it's not true. He appeared before hundreds with several eyewitnesses. Okay, the second of the 3 other hypotheses, the swoon theory. These are the most popular. These are the only ones I thought worthy of presenting. The rest are just crazy. Swoon theory, Jesus temporarily fainted on the cross and then went to his tomb and was just passed out and then woke up and walked out of the tomb. That's really popular. It's crazy. This is pure speculation again, completely lacking in any evidence. Impossible to survive Roman crucifixion. If they crucified you, they assured that you were killed, especially with Jesus. There's a lot of details like, let's poke his side and, make sure he's dead. There's no chance that Jesus survived Roman crucifixion. If by any chance he did, he would not have been in a state to 3 days later push a rock out of the way and then push it back and then leave. What else? The tomb was guarded by people. Okay, the last one, disciples stole the body. This was the early church response. I think this is debunked by the fact that the apostles died. They wouldn't have died for a while. So if the disciples actually went and stole the body of Jesus, then later on, whenever they were being pressed and being told, did Jesus die or did you steal his body? I'm going to kill you if you say that he died and raised from the dead. They would have said, yeah, I was lying, but don't kill me. Don't kill my family, don't kill my little girl, don't kill my daughter. Yeah, the disciples would not have gone with their story. They would not have died. Also, again, the tomb was as secure as possible. There's a large stone, it's sealed, it's guarded. The disciples would have been hard to just get in there and push that large stone away, sit quietly while being quiet all the guards. Because they said that it was while they were sleeping, but it would have made a lot of noise. So yeah, those are the alternative hypotheses. And as you've hopefully seen, none of them make sense. And all of the historical evidence points toward a real bodily resurrection of Jesus. There's no reason to believe anything else. So what? How should this change my life? Well, I'll invite the worship team back up. We're going to sing a couple more songs. But why does it matter that Jesus raised from the dead? Again, like I mentioned in the beginning, this is the most important thing to consider. So as we sing these songs, I'd love for for you to consider these truths, and then I'll come back up and close this out. Father, I thank you for how good you are to us. I thank you that you sent your Son to die and then raised him from the dead. I thank you that our faith is based on you. You don't change. You make promises and you keep them. You hold us fast, secure. I thank you for those truths. I thank you that we can have faith in you with the littlest amount of evidence or with the grandest amount. I thank you that these events that we talk about, that are written in our Bibles, are not just words, but they are true. Thank you that they actually happened. You are the author of history. You're sovereign, Lord. And as you have worked in the world, there have been footprints and fingerprints all over our world that show that you are who you say you are. And then we are confronted with a choice to believe that you are who all of history says that you are. That you are the God of the universe, who loves us and is willing to save us. Or we can reject that truth, reject you, continue in our rebellion, live a life without true love, never experiencing your grace, your gentleness, your peace, the joy that you give, the joy that I have experienced, Lord, that I want these young men and women to experience. May they accept these truths as true, and not just believe them, but conform their lives to them. We thank you, Lord. We love you.